Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Film industry professionals discussing the Oscar nominees in their category of expertise. That's what you're getting from Below the Line for the rest of the month. This is episode 9 of the series, and today we're talking about costume design. Let me introduce our guests. First, happy to welcome back regular Oscar panelist Helen Huang, whose credits include Beef, The Penguin, and the upcoming Blade Runner 2099 series, which will air on Prime. Glad to have you back, Helen.
Hi, Skid. How are you?
Doing okay. Glad you could be here. Also joining us, returning to the show but making her Oscar panel debut, is Liz Vastola, whose credits include Twisted Metal, Daredevil, and The Bondsman, which we're expecting soon. Thrilled you could join us, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
This is going to be fun. We do like to take a moment, though, each episode this season. We're pausing to reflect on the LA wildfires. The fires are contained, but the impact will be felt for years, if not decades. To all of our industry colleagues and everyone affected, we see you. Okay, let's talk movies. The 2024 nominees for costume design are A Complete Unknown, Conclave, Gladiator II, Nosferatu, and Wicked. We're going to discuss them in that order, and spoilers are possible, so consider this awarding. Last note, I'm going to recognize the nominated costume designers by name, but apologies in advance if I mispronounce any. Helen and Liz, please correct me if I mangle the names of your colleagues. First up, A Complete Unknown, costume design by Ariane Phillips.
Well, obviously, big fan of Ariane's work. Everything she does is such. It's difficult to describe, but it's very subtle in the best way. It's very just beautiful, but kind of, not costumey, understated, and very real, but has this very rich emotional quality to it. And especially this film, I think they captured the journey of Bob Dylan in terms of his personal growth in such an elegant way. And also, she's an extensive researcher. Actually, all the nominees are. The way they research sort of that period in time, and especially with the type of people that was around in that era, I thought was pretty amazing. And then I think, one of the things to really talk about is how to do period, but in such a delicate manner, and how sort of detailed you have to get with the silhouette, the prints, and even down to styling the characters to really reflect the nuance of an era without, being hey, this is the 60s. And I just think she did such a beautiful job.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that such a hard task, to say the least, when you're recreating the story and the visual world of such an icon, obviously American icon, but then worldwide, I think. And then on top of that, knowing that you have an audience, not only from, of course, the music industry, but just fans and people who are still alive that have grew up with Bob Dylan and probably knew this journey inside and out as they experienced it themselves, let alone, someone that's, Bob Dylan, of course, still alive. And so the pressure and the expectation, I feel, is so layered in this kind of work. And I was really just struck and inspired by her ability to kind of clearly get into the frame of reference that all these different, living people, not only Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, even, Johnny Cash, how they approached clothing and dressing themselves, not only for the stage, but also in their interior worlds, where we might not have seen them or they might not have been photographed, but then took that frame of reference and melded it and tailored it, so to speak, for the actors and bodies and characterizations that she had to work with. So, that's such a difficult and just really nuanced job at hand. And I think that it really like melded so beautifully. You know, that first image of Timothy Chalamet when he's finally kind of morphed into, let's say, like the darker era of Bob Dylan with the, you know, really moppy black hair and the black shades and the black Levi's and just the darker palette. When you first see him kind of emerge on the street in that iconic look, it really kind of takes your breath away and you kind of you know, for me that was a moment where I was like, oh, you know, where everybody watching is on board, you know, with and in believing the story, you know, that's being told. And so and it's just like really beautiful to see costume achieve so much of that in the storytelling.
That was like such a strong reveal when he
Mhm.
came the full sort of like that iconic Dylan with the hair and the shades. You know, I read somewhere that Ariane sourced a lot of vintage for the movie, which I think is actually technically pretty amazing because a lot of times, you know, on a technical level, you want to use vintage when you're doing vintage films, but time really limits you. Sometimes budget does too, because when you buy vintage, you can't really necessarily like return. So it is a mass amount of resources to look at vintage clothing to use them for a movie. So I think that part of it was really like amazing because I remember I think she found like a Romanesque coat for Sylvie
Mm.
for Dakota Fanning's character, and that's I think that's pretty spectacular for her to be able to do that. Other elements I feel like that she accomplished so well is like this idea of where the artists have been as they journey throughout their lives. So, like, there was a particular coat that Joan Baez like wore that was after she did some research, they discovered it was probably a Mary Quant, so a London designer from the 60s. And they recreated that coat, but because the images of Joan were in black and white, they decided to change, you know, to sort of make up the color of what she would appear on screen. And this is, I feel like, sort of like a thread that you'll see in a lot of these nominees is like they do really intensive sort of research, whether historical through images, whether it's painting, if the time frame is, you know, different and before photography and then photography, but then a lot of their sort of custom builds are adjusted in terms of color or fabrication to fit the particular project that they're in, whether reflecting how that item of clothing goes with the cinematography or the production design or how it follows the narrative of the story. And I think her in particular, when researching Dylan in terms of like where he was at the beginning of the film, the middle of the film, and the last images of the film, and then even how, you know, these artists travel to London and were inspired by, you know, the mod kind of London aesthetic. It was pretty like this undercurrent of where they have been and how that projects on screen is kind of like psychological background for the audience and lends itself to the realism and the believability of what's going on screen.
Yeah, totally. And I'm sure you read this, Helen, there. I read that she was also not only in terms of the sourcing of vintage with is now, I mean, sadly gets trickier and trickier, right?
Yeah, it is very tricky.
Right. I mean, I worry one day it's going to be impossible, right? I mean, in terms of finite number of clothing, but that, you know, existed. But I also read that she was able to get Levi's on board with her to remake a certain style of straight leg jean that they had only made for, I think it was like a 4 or 6 year span. And they
Yeah.
confirmed that it was what Dylan wore. And you know, collaborations like that, where you're able to work with clothing companies, but then just have them service your vision, you know,
Hmm.
and really truly collaborate and work for you, you know, it's just is great to hear. I know Levi's is always so supportive of designers. I feel like so I didn't surprise me that that came about, but yeah, it's Yeah, really, it might get even rougher in the years to come with vintage and yeah.
I think it's just for me when I think about, that type of sourcing and then sort of collaboration with brands to remake things, it's just the enormous amount of time that it does take. And I feel like for me personally, it's not really about finding the vintage, it's more about productions shrinking your prep time
Yeah.
and sort of not giving as much weight to things being authentic or things looking special, or like in sadder terms, like the way we know how to do them and sort of asking us for the shortcuts. But she has worked with Jim Mangold for like 6 films. And I feel like when you have collaborators in a director like that, they then can be an advocate for your creative process and allow production, if it's important to them, to give you the time and the resources to do things the way that you know would take a film from visually from in costume design from like an 80 to like 100. I'm sure you felt that, Liz, in terms of
Yeah.
the expectations of our industry in terms of what they think is acceptable. I think it's very weird because you have your own standards and then there's the acceptable standards of your production. So
Yeah.
All right, we are off to an informative start. We're going to move on to the second film on our list, Conclave, costume design by Lissy Crystal.
so Conclave is I love this movie like so much. I think I don't know, for lack of a better way to say it, Conclave is a film that was so surprising in terms of like A, how amazing the storytelling is, but B, how they were able to make spaces I feel like can be filmed in a way that's not very interesting and make them interesting. So, like the idea of the production design where they took, different elements of where, the Vatican and sort of like changed it a little bit just so it has this like charge that's parallel with the tension of the narrative, I think was amazing. And then her costume design in terms of like how it fits as a graphic image in the movie, so superb. Like doing uniforms, regardless, is very hard on research, but also the decision of having strong uniforms and then having it just be the majority of the screen time, how much of it is real? How much of it do we really take from the research that we could use in it? And then how much of it do we heighten or sort of change for cinematic purposes on screen? And for example, she talked a lot about the type of reds the cardinal was wearing. The current red, I think, is a very poppy kind of like orangey based red. And she used red from the 1960s where it was a little bit darker because she felt like as an image that is stronger and also more palatable to the audience. She changed the fabric to make it wool, so it feels heavier. I think all these sort of small adjustments make a film just in general more cohesive. These liberties, and then just like what is research and what is cinematic bandwidth, just like giving you the creative freedom to be like, this is a film, you know, we are creating images. And so, therefore, after all the research, after understanding all the details, we choose to edit these details. And I feel like that's very important to talk about because it doesn't matter if a film is period, which a lot of these films are, or if a film is contemporary. The director is choosing with his camera to edit how the world should look. And the production designer is doing that as well as a cinematographer. And so when it comes to costume design, I think sometimes people don't think of the fact that even with contemporary clothes, we are editing a version of the world for the audience to see. And it has a lot to do with how everything, the trifecta of visuals appear on screen. And so I think it's very important to point out in something like this is that they took something that could be not so interesting and highlighted it. It took it to a different level because they did this round of research and then editing and then considering the cinematic world as a whole to the audience.
And I think what's so remarkable about this version of exactly what you're talking about, Helen, is as an audience member who has not done that research, like
Yeah.
who may not even, be familiar at all, there's not a moment in watching Conclave where you're taken out of it because you're
Yeah.
questioning. And even in this film, they took such incredible, like, fine art liberties in terms of the way they used color between not only, the costumes, but production design, the camera. I mean, there's such intense moments of color where you're really feeling you're looking at like the modernist painting version of a
Hmm.
16th century tradition. I mean, it is like it's so sumptuous and saturated. Going off of what you're saying, Helen, as well, I know that Isabella Rossellini's costume was a complete departure,
Yeah.
from what it would have been. They changed the style from, the crosses that the different cardinals would wear from what would traditionally be, I think, wooden to something more, metal and just these liberties that you would at the beginning of your research think is, maybe very risky because she has such a command and control of the world. She's able to take these steps in the costume design that enhance the storytelling and also enhance just the art of the film without you falling out of it. Without ever someone watching the movie and be like, is that really? You just believe it wholesale because in essence, it's just so she achieves the world and the sort of severity of it all to such like a perfect degree that the color and the fabrication and the even cut of, the nuns' outfits are, she's able to make these kind of artistic choices for the betterment of the work, and I think that that is like just such an achievement, and something that even me reading about, the process of the film, I didn't even expect to read. I expected to read that this was the red and this is the wool and this is it. But the fact that they were able to make these choices and be so successful in the direction is just like so impressive. And yeah, really added, I felt like so much to how they told the story.
I think also it's important to point out that she is also a longtime collaborator with the director. She's done multiple movies with him.
Yes.
He was actually on a podcast where he mentioned two big sort of stylistic choices that he did was something that came from her research, and one was the umbrella. As the cardinals entered into the conclave, that graphic image was from research that she did, and also the fact that she was like, I think they should hold umbrellas. And then the other element was the nuns at the end in those white uniforms, which had, because of the color, such a poignant exclamation point on just the narrative in general towards all the build up towards the end of the movie. And that was also from her research. And so I really like hearing these details because sometimes through research, you could even if you haven't really thought of it, it could really inform a director's choice about how he wants to use costumes to tell the story. And I really like that dialogue between longtime collaborators where you could show them something and they could change actually something that they've written or have thought about to just, again, like you were saying, to just like use these moments of color or non-color to really stress the tension and the speed of the storytelling. She always does like really spectacularly beautiful work.
Yeah. And that's such a through line also with all the films today. I mean, I think, when we talk about Wicked, Paul and John work together on In the Heights, I believe, or yeah, I believe. But, it's something, these kind of long collaborations that filmmakers can have with their colleagues, costume design, production design is so important to nurture, I feel, from a production standpoint, because that is, I mean, this is the list of films today is, case in point of when you're able to really, continue to work with people who inspire you and who you work well with. I find, and often, in the beginning of a designer's career, sometimes things will happen where they'll be like, well, they want me to hire somebody local, or they need to, like, or I need to sort of make sure, my team is from this country, or, the cost of bringing a collaborator in can sometimes be an issue with production. And it's just something that when you're able to, and I'm sure, Helen, you find this
Yeah.
own work, I certainly find it in mine, when you're able to continue to work and grow with certain showrunners, directors, filmmakers, even actors,
Hmm.
it's so enriching and really helps the work, and so, that's not to say to not give folks a chance, of course, but I wish that was something sometimes that was more honored at the lower beginning levels, lower budget levels, to be like, oh,
Yeah.
and different directors and showrunners. I mean, of course, we're talking about like, five fabulously successful directors here, but, are make the decision to fight for that more than others. And it's so great and inspiring to see these directors, a lot of the directors having worked continuously with these designers, obviously
Yeah.
respect them, to the nth degree.
That does make such a big difference on projects. Also, when directors come more into power, studios let them make
Mm-hmm.
more decisions, they trust them more, and therefore all the HODs benefit from that trust.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that is definitely something important to talk about, is like, I guess, the allocation of power in a production, and how your costumes ultimately is a result of, sometimes it's like other people's decisions. It's like what resources they give you, how honest you could be with your director in terms of what you want. And then also with collaborators, it's like you could push them out of their comfort zone, because sometimes directors have a smaller comfort zone and they don't want to, they have to trust you for you to be like, I know this is a little bit weird, but I think it'll be rewarding at the end. And I think also it's sort of like directors who trust their HODs really do come out with like a richer project, because they think about projects as a whole, but we think about costumes on such a different level in terms of how it fits into like cinematic history, how it works with psychology. And so, how culture shifts happen. And so it's like this knowledge of being able to study the subject, but then you have to convince other people that what they understand in how they view costumes is sometimes more limited, and they should have the trust to like broaden it, and it would actually be more intriguing to the audience. Because also sometimes I feel like they limit costumes because they think the audience will understand it. But the thing is, you're supposed to show the audience what they should look at,
Yes.
not the other way around.
Yes.
Okay.
For those who don't know, HOD, that's heads of department. So our costume designers, our production designer, these folks collaborating with the director. I know it's underlining the point, but it struck me from just talking about these two films, you have two different approaches to how you're going to execute on costume. Where Complete Unknown, you're recreating a pair of Levi's that only existed for a couple of years, that sort of vintage. And on this side, we're talking about, no, let's take what's there and change the colors. But in both cases, and very successful with these films, creating the cohesive vision of what we're going to see on the screen. And it's because of the collaboration. Again, I know I'm
Yeah.
underlining the point that you guys have illustrated well, but that collaboration is why it's possible.
Skid, you just brought about a point. It's sort of like, it also depends on what type of movie it is. Because sometimes, you follow what the movie wants. So if the movie wants to be very naturalistic and simple, your costume design has to follow that. And that is the point of the movie. if it's for, other purposes, if you're looking at Conclave, it's like there is this parallel between the storytelling and the visuals on the screen and the graphicness of how they want each image. And so therefore, when she designs, that's what she's designing to is the purpose of the film. And
Mhm.
so when you look at and dissect all these costumes, it's like, yes, there is a basic level of research making the costumes, but it's also on this broader scale, is like, what is the point of the movie? And that is what the director follows, what the cinematographer and what the production design follows. And so costume has to follow that. So sometimes the end result is in service of it's in service of the movie, not just designing costumes as if, the choices are just all yours.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also think that, to some extent, people's proximity to a complete unknown,
Mhm.
you might drive some of that as well, where it might take you out in a way to just change the cut of
Yeah,
clothes that he's wearing in a way that's like, there is a little bit more of a maybe an audience want, an expectation, which, you can either play to or not play to. Not really saying that an audience
yeah,
expectation should be driving your design choice, but it does seem to me that there was the responsibility that they felt to pay homage and to
yeah,
recreate in a way, so that the audience could peek behind the curtain and
yeah,
see Dylan and Joan's apartment and see how
yeah,
he wrote and kind of and understand that very finite section of years that the film is talking about in the production design and in every sense of storytelling, whereas for Conclave it seems so much more about the suspense, the narrative, and less about what is actually happening when a conclave happens, from a like
yeah,
documentarian
yeah,
perspective. And so that also might be, kind of driving the differences. Completely different ways about it, and equally obvious, I feel, successful to, as Helen put it, the point of the film.
Well, let's carry this thinking into our discussion about the third film on our list, Gladiator II, costume design by Janty Yates and Dave Crossman. Is it Janty or Yanty? I don't know.
I think it's Janty because
Okay, good.
we talked to her when we were going to Prague. Um, Liz, do you want to start us out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this has seemed to me such an interesting, knowing that Janty had designed the first Gladiator movie 20 years prior. It felt in, kind of watching the movie, I had this sort of parallel experience, not only in just, wanting to take in the costume design from, the perspective of any viewer, but also just this kind of thought into like the thesis that she's returning to, when in returning to this material and coming at it, kind of 20 years later and a similar storyline, a similar of course, we flash forwarded, a certain amount of years in Gladiator 2 from Gladiator 1, and kind of responding to the world in a way that kind of matched, how the protagonist, being Maximus's son, there was kind of a parallel there between like her returning to the material, the family, seeing the family as a new iteration of this material and how she was going to approach that. And then, of course, the first movie being so wildly successful and iconic, and how you're going to come back to it and pay homage to it, but also breathe new life, into the costumes and think about, a more modern, present day eye on the world. And, it was kind of interesting also in reading about how she went about it and different traditions and, historical reference that she borrowed from. I read that, she used Indian saris in order to kind of make some of the toga and tunic draping for the women, and of course, more of kind of a, let's say, like bombastic flair with Denzel Washington's costumes, and how it feels similar in that when you are so close to and have done such a phenomenal amount of, and decades, let's say, worth of research in the setting of the film that you're able to then, it so well and you feel so confident. And again, the collaboration is there that you're able to take more artistic license in order to service the characters and the story, which I feel like otherwise might feel like a very finite amount that you're allowed to play with. I think when a sort of usual sensibility when thinking about Roman costume and historical dress is that, it's a very kind of finite toolbox that you have to play with. And so to hear that she's able to kind of borrow and use and kind of reinterpolate different ideas into that toolbox and again never make it feel like you're out of the world, I think is really inspiring, especially for a movie on that scale.
I think speaking to just in terms of like fabrication for a movie like that and sort of textile research and availability, we'll get into this also when we talk about Nosferatu.
Mhm.
It's like movies past like a certain decade, even with The Complete Unknown, I've heard movies past a certain amount of time frame. It's like you don't have photographic evidence. A lot of the clothes does not survive in museums. And so a lot of the museum pieces are also reconstructions. I know she looked at a lot of paintings for her references. Like for Denzel's character, she looked at Jean-Léon Jerome in terms of like paintings. And I was thinking about this idea of like capturing the feeling of a time frame rather than obviously they can't do it exactly because those textiles don't exist anymore. Those artisans that made those things don't exist. Some colorways and how they dye things don't exist anymore. And obviously with the production, things can't be done in the exact same way and it has to move faster. And so like her sourcing, like you said, the textiles from India, to create some of the tunics is just another way of understanding how your materials, it doesn't have to be exact, but the research that you do, the understanding from your director and production designer is to understand sort of where you're going in terms of like how the feeling of what your textiles, what you want on the screen to get an approximate feeling of the time period that you're trying to do. And I think that's very interesting. The other thing I think is very interesting is like just in general of trying to find artisans that could still do the embroider work or still do that dye work. Fortunately, in Europe, there's a long-standing tradition of craft. And so you do find all these artisans that's able to do all these things that you might not actually been able to get people to do in the US because they have more of a history of craft and sort of like holding on to the craftsmanship and that's needed for something like that. And so I feel like that's also very interesting is how you as a designer solve the problem of you don't have the original sort of even the original materials and how you would go about transforming materials today or supplementing it to where it really feels like the time period. And obviously there is something really interesting about looking at a time period through the interpretation of a painting or a painter, because also I feel like that in itself is already a derivative of actual fact. And so it's like seeing things through actual lens, then seeing things through a secondary lens in terms of painting, and then having the real life job of interpreting all that. So I think Janti's always been so amazing at doing that. Also, with Ridley Scott's movies, it's always so exaggerated. And I feel like,
Mm-hmm.
that their costumes with the hair and the makeup really gave it such a theatrical feeling instead of, like previously what we said is like, it's not a documentary. It's like, it's a theatrical event. And so everything is sort of approached with that level of like theatricality.
Yeah, I felt like this iteration of the story felt the costumes and the accessories, the armor, there was like a heaviness to it, which I thought that was really successful because I felt one of the major differences I felt between this Gladiator 2 and the first Gladiator is there was really a more of like a gauzy, wistful mysticalness to the first film
Hmm.
that not only in the costume but in the, just sort of the flashbacks and the storytelling and the camera work in Gladiator 2 felt heavier, when he starts to see visions of his wife dying and the sort of version of death that he's envisioning. It's gray and it's dark and it's by a shoreline and there's like dark gravel. And I felt like that kind of darkness and weight kind of worked through not only in the heavy of course the accessories. I'm thinking of Denzel, he's always sporting the earrings which are now so iconic, just this sort of like really heavy metal, but also even in using kind of sari fabrics and this heavy embroidery. And even I think I read at one point on one of the pieces of armor, they were thinking of, I think it's the armor that has like the two horses facing each other or two motifs facing each other. It was going to be one, and then she liked it so much, she's like, let's just put them both. It's kind of this like more is more mentality, which I think also matches the vibe of this film, and I
Yeah.
think goes along with your read, Helen, of the heightened theatricality and wanting the stakes to be even higher, to feel more investment in this version of the story. And I really felt like that came through in the costume. And it also might, speak to a present day eye on, now that we've seen Gladiator 20 years before, and we've seen iterations of the Colosseum and Rome and, different sort of looking back at, just Roman costume. It's kind of, it's like adding something to it and telling more, the story in a more kind of intense and new and heavy way, which I thought was really interesting.
All you said is I completely agree with. This is a hard thing to sort of articulate. But in terms of like a period costume movies, I feel like there is this element of you can't escape the decade that it was made in. And
Mhm.
so the first film was made in the 2000s, and it's sort of like the colorways, the fabric choices, everything is sort of tied to things that were viewed as cinematic or viewed as attractive at the time, even
Yeah.
silhouettes, because sometimes with silhouettes, you're tailoring it to like what actors are used to, even though it is a very historical film. And so you can't escape the decade really that it's made in. I mean, it was made in the 2000s, but it looks like it was made in like the late 1990s, in terms of the first film. And then in the second film, obviously, even with new technology, maybe how Ridley likes to shoot, if he's shooting faster, all things like that really influence, like the trend of the day really influence how films look and how different they look, especially in something that's a sequel like 20 years later. And so I think that's very interesting. Going back to Denzel's character, I also think it's interesting, in terms of like if you talk about what actors are comfortable with,
Hmm.
is that you could do all this research or you could be like, this is fabulous and you could wear this and it's fabulous. But if they don't want to wear it, because I think she wanted him to wear a turban
Hmm.
and he didn't want to wear a turban. And so it's sort of like what you see on screen again is like a collaboration between everyone, but also what the actors are comfortable with and the input. Also, Liz, you probably know this. It's like the bigger the actor, the more they have a say
A
in terms of
hundred
like what
percent.
they wear.
Yeah.
And so
A
if
hundred
you like
percent.
do all this fabulous research and they come in a fitting and they're like, nope, that's not happening. And you
Yeah.
have to like really, really adjust to sort of like, okay, what do I know that they're okay with? What is their box? And then giving them that box and then being like, hey, here's some bangles,
Yes.
here's some earrings. Do you also want to put this on? And so it's this dance of being in service to the production, being in service to your director, and then when actors coming in, being in service to them a little bit too, and in something historical like this, and to see what the final costume is, in terms of that kind of dialogue.
Don't you always find too, Helen, that after you have fitting with either the number one, or if it's maybe a actor or actress in your project that's of outsized celebrity to the comparison to everybody else. And the
Mhm.
showrunner, the director is always like, so how did it go? Like, are they going to wear what
Yeah.
they were going to wear? And you sort of have to like decompress,
Well,
and it's always the reaction or the sort of like, so what do you know that I don't know? Yeah.
actually, like a little bit of industry tidbit, is that my approach now is more like that's your problem.
Yes.
That's not my problem. Like I show them what you
Yeah.
want. I show them what I like. You can't make anybody, whether they're big or small. Actually, I've had this problem with, not problem, but it's just like it's just a part of it.
Yeah.
With bigger actors, smaller actors, obviously smaller actors, they'll put things on, even if they don't like it. Also, it depends on the project. Sometimes if the project is very period and it's removed from what they normally wear, it's easier to convince them to wear things. But if you really want them to wear something, that is a director problem and that is a producer problem. That is not my
Yes.
problem.
Yes.
And what you're saying is very correct, is like sometimes they put it on you to be like, did you convince them? And it's like,
Right.
I don't get paid enough to get into an argument with a number one. So you get paid enough to
Yeah.
do it. And so, not to say that you have that happen a lot, but there are instances where that has happened and you're just like, not my problem.
Mhm, mhm. And I think ultimately, I mean, to bring it back to Gladiator II, I mean, clearly Denzel's character, clearly she's inspired by and is in service to his characterization.
Yes.
And so everything that she brought to the table, costume wise, and that he ultimately wears, feels so in sync with how
He is as a person. Yeah.
exactly. And that, you can do so much research and so make so many choices, and it really doesn't get crystallized until you're in that fitting and you're in, or, hopefully you're talking beforehand, but whatever the schedule allows for, and you're able to kind of like riff off of each other and understand what the actor is going to do and how they're going to portray the character, and then you can fine tune and sort of collaborate in a way that'll be successful for you both,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because also if the actor's wearing something uncomfortable or they feel like it's distracting, it does affect their performance. And so
Totally.
ultimately it's like, if they want something pared back, you sort of you figure out what they want and you design something that fits in the space of what they want and what the project is.
Yeah.
And so that's the ultimate dialogue and compromise. And I don't want to say anything in terms of like, oh, this is like a negative thing. It's not. It's like there is so much conversation
Mm-hmm.
as a costume designer before people see the final product. And I feel like we should dispel the myth that what goes on screen is everything we hope it would be, everything that we wanted it to be, because
Totally.
we are in the end in service of characters and in service of our director in the movies and what they're trying to produce. And so we're a part of a system,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of pieces to that system before you see what you see on screen. And so I'm sure you would agree, it's to highlight all the problem solving that we have to do
Yes.
in terms of like people understanding that it's a craft. We're not developing a collection on a runway. It's a very different process. It's not just about the clothes. And so you have to navigate a whole slew of things on top of producing clothes. And
Yes.
so that's what makes costume design its own thing. And we're not stylists or fashion designers. It's very much its own niche thing that people study so much and is a part of a long tradition of cinematic craft.
Yeah. 100%.
Exploring that is why we do those episodes. I really appreciate you guys bringing on this
Thank you.
all the prompts I was asking about that movie, about the sequel, about costume major actors. You guys did without me saying anything. See, we're in good hands. We're in good hands. Share your expertise and thoughts about the fourth film on our list, Nosferatu, costume design by Linda Muir.
Well, first of all, it's like a very scrumptious film, but all his films are. I like to just say, just his films in general because he started out as he did a lot of things in theater, the director, and he also did production design and costume design. And I think that's why his visuals are so strong and what he asks from his HODs are so specific. And they do an immense amount of historical research. But going back to what I was saying is like, you're in service to what the director wants to do. And this director is like those weird shapes from that time period, the things that look really, really, really odd to the audience, those are the things I want. So don't hold back on the strangeness of something. And I feel like that's very refreshing because especially during that time period, I think the time period was like 1838. The time period between 1830s to like 1840s is a period of dress. It's like post-Regency that a lot of people find really ugly, like just in terms of like in general, because it's the silhouettes are hard to understand. The hairstyles are hard to understand. The hat styles are extremely hard to understand. And so a lot of productions will hold back on that because they think, audiences can't understand that. Case in point, all the male leads in sort of that kind of time period, even 1600, 1700, they'll wear boots. They won't wear tights, even though historically they'll wear tights because they're filtering through a modern day lens. But for Edgar's, he wants it real. And I think that's what makes his movies so special. And people are like, this is amazing. But they don't understand that it's because he allows sort of like the weirdness, the truthfulness of a time period to come through. And I would encourage people all directors to have that approach. Step outside of your box. Let it be weird. We want weird. As costume designers, we love weird. Let's do it, Yeah, we want weird. Just let us do it. Let us be like, yes, maybe the audience will find it weird, but you know what? Those movies get nominated for Oscars.
Poor things. Poor things.
Yeah. It's like, let it do its thing. Those will get nominated for Oscars, not holding back and being like, I want a sexy hero. That's not going to win you any Oscars.
Yeah, 100%. And it's so smart to understand that, for them both to understand that weirdness and like strange silhouette will not be comfortable for a contemporary actor or contemporary cast. It adds to the horror of, adds to sort of those silhouettes that's sort of like straight on and then, following the camera then to something else that's, that's going to be the only thing taking up most of your frame helps the horror and helps the sort of like even the moments of jump scare that and again sort of applauding a movie where the costume design is so integral to the storytelling and then also to the genre. And that being said, I mean, you make these choices in recreating the silhouettes, but then the fabrication becomes so important. And like your choice in fabric, which you really could make, it could almost be anything. I mean, obviously let's stick to cotton, silks, and wools, but it could almost be whatever you want it to be because you're in this sort of, fantastical horror, your toolbox is bigger. And being able to hone it in and choose the prints and the levels of velvet and the exact weight of wool and the specific color brown is almost even more pressure and more difficult because those textiles are so, front and center for most of the movie. That particular weight of that gauzy cotton or linen that, of that nightgown is or that particular floral print is just such a literal fabric of the film. It almost, becomes with the production design as well, because so much of the production design is so dark, that agonizing over those details it's just so amazing and beautiful, the choices made.
So when I was working on Blade Runner, our team was the team that did Nosferatu in Prague. So they worked with her I got to see their textile book on their MTM, their made to order things, and it was so incredibly beautiful in terms of like her inspirations. What are the textiles they chose? And I do want to talk about the textiles too, Liz, because because of making things, it's like, what people don't understand is like making clothes is very, very hard. It's extremely hard.
Yeah,
You will not know how a garment turns out until it turns out because it has to go through, again, we talk about like limits, right? So like say you have a piece like Nosferatu, they're in Europe, so they get to order in from the best European textile people. So they are ordering from London, they're doing Italy, sometimes it's from India. So like that is a benefit of having to design it in Europe. And then also, again, all the craftspeople in Europe, they're trained very differently. And so that's how they're able to do it. If you have an American production and say it's filming in LA, they might not like sourcing all your fabrics from,
yep,
Europe because it costs so much. And so those type of restraints, economic restraints, actually really impact how something like Nosferatu looks on screen. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we should talk about. The other challenge of making something is it depends on your tailor. You give them your inspiration.
hmm
If they understand it, they could crank you out and pattern you something so beautiful. Your seamstresses can make it. If you give them something they don't understand, they might
yes,
not be able to make it. And so it's also who your craftsperson who they are and how they interpret what you're trying to say. And I think that's very important is because we're not an island.
right,
We have ideas, but it goes through so many steps with people. Like the color brown, Liz, that you mentioned, that could go through several dye processes.
yes,
And the other thing is, again, we should talk about money and time because the time it takes to make an iteration, say, no, this is not what I want, to do it again, that's a luxury. That is a luxury of prep. Sometimes you get one one take and it goes on screen, whether you like it or not, it's on screen,
exactly.
you know. It's a luxury in our industry if we get two stabs at something. Just to be in comparison about like fashion shows, John Galliano, so twirls are sort of like what you make in muslin in terms of like the drape or the silhouette of something. So you make a twirl before you would make an actual garment. He gets 19 twirls before they come to actual fabrication and what that garment looks like. We get two tries
Yeah,
at the most. So that is what we're talking about in terms of like making something. And so the fact that this film looks like the way it does almost is
extraordinary.
amazing,
Yeah,
extraordinary in terms of her skill, the skills of her tailors, the skills of her dyers, and then what Edgar's is also his standards and what he looks for. Just to give people a peek inside
yeah.
the incredible crunch time. It's insane sometimes. So it's like you're just like, oh, that skirt doesn't fit. That's fine because it's going on. Like no production has ever stopped itself because a costume is not ready.
No, no. And it's so true. Costume design is so much about at any level, at the very high budget, even at, lower budget, assessing what you have in the room from your tailor. If you have a dye, what dye house are you using?
Yeah.
Who your shop buyers are, et cetera, who the stitchers are, and then having to make the decision of, well, what it like, how do I need to then sort of
Yes.
I got to get something successful with the amazing folks that I have and what people's strengths are and what, and having to sort of manage that is such an untaught, not a taught, tool. It's something you even, continue to refine the more and more you work in the different departments you have. And the other thing that I think becomes more and more difficult is that the fabrics we work with, they say they're 100 cotton, they say they're, 60/40 something, they may or may not be that, and also what are in modern day, what are the additional chemicals that have been, created, crafted, and then kind of like dumped all over the fabrics in order to be able to withstand staining and withstand dye and, have more longevity and unfortunately not break down when they get, inevitably thrown out into a landfill. And I think that is another kind of like problem of the modern designer and having to kind of counteract all of these new issues with textile that you don't have time for, you don't have money for, and you're not prepared for, and just speaks again to the work in Nosferatu and to that really, really fine detail and achievement on that incredibly like intimate textile level, where we're really up there and close in the seams of the hats and the millinery and the bows and the edges and the bindings. We can see all of that, and he hangs his camera on all of that, and so it just goes to show how much he loves and respects that, the finery of it all, and then what an achievement, Linda was able to execute.
Something else that I want to talk about and point out is like, so with period costumes, especially with women, a lot of the structure comes from the underpinnings. And I really like that in this movie, because of her character and sort of like the undressed parts of her character, you get to see sort of all these things that really create the look of the silhouette. I think that's really fascinating in terms of like for the viewer to visually look at. I think also like something like that is a reason why sometimes when historical or like costumes on display will look different than in the movies, because they did not take the underpinnings, and so they don't have that wow factor, because sort of what the wow factor is the under garments itself. The other thing is I want to talk about is like corsets used in this movie. So there is a particular corset used for men. I forgot the character's name, but he is Hutter's friend whose wife Ellen dies. Not Ellen, his wife dies. And he is wearing actually a male corset under his costume. And I feel like it gives a particular silhouette, and his clothes, if you look at it, the shoulders are sloped in a certain way. And it's so the proportion play of that because of the underpinning is very, very strong. And also that subtlety again lends itself to the weirdness of not the weirdness, but just like the specificity that the audience really could see, And then even with Ellen's corsets, it's like they take consideration to like a front lace corset that she could undo herself in terms of like the technical sequences of the movie. And so there's all these considerations for things that, yes, you do get a glimpse of in the movie, but have like almost is not perceivable to the audience, but makes such a big difference in sort of how the final costumes look. And I think that's the finite details of his film is like there is like what you see on screen, but then there is like this undercurrent of excellence to how they make things. His big thing is like the excellence, and then the almost like slave to the invisible hand of how things look at a certain time period, and then it accumulates with how special it looks, on screen. And even Liz, to what you're speaking of for textiles, it's like humans have such an emotional reaction to textiles and to color on a very subconscious level, that utilizing it any film, whether contemporary or period, is that thing in your toolbox that will unconsciously spark the audience to feel a certain thing, to a character. And I think his films are always such a perfect illustration of that.
Yeah.
All right, the fifth film on our list is Wicked, costume design by Paul Tazwell.
So this is such an interesting sort of remit of a project, I think, because I mean, I remember seeing Wicked on Broadway. I grew up, I'm a New Yorker, grew up in New York, and I remember seeing it on Broadway whenever I did in the 2000s growing up. And the costume design, Susan Hilferty, who did the costume design for the Broadway show, was so different, not only for Broadway, but just in terms of, using costume and off-kilter asymmetrical shapes and colors and again fabric, and playing with the sort of audience expectation of knowing the story of the Wizard of Oz and, understanding, and having it be such an iconic film. I mean, like one of the films ever created, right? And then taking that set of knowledge and then sort of reinterpolating it in Wicked and in this new story, born of, the Wizard of Oz, just her use of pinstripe and the way in which, suits are sort of, there's one shoulder on one side and then one kind of raglan sleeve on another. And it was really, it still continues to be remarkable. I mean, the same costumes are still on Broadway that Susan designed all those years ago. And what immediately struck me about Wicked is Paul's ability to pay homage to that. And, there's so much in the marketing and the discussion around Wicked of paying homage to the musical and, sort of making sure that the fans of the musical feel serviced, and the creators of the musical obviously involved in the creation of the film. And Paul is able to do that, but on a cinematic level, get in there with sort of these pinstripes going down these shiz uniforms that then all of a sudden kind of lose their way and then kind of find themselves down the pants of the leg. I mean, all those tiny little details, it's as if he is like, I see you, Susan, and this is my sort of the way I, am interpreting what you did and also sort of, just making it outsized, for a enormous screen, so that when you watch it and you're able to really take in all of these details in a way that a audience for a musical can't, of course, from, beyond the proscenium of the stage. I thought that was really confident on his part and also really just exciting. I didn't think he, it's sort of it was interesting to me because I feel like he could have there was one way to handle the film would be to take a totally different direction, and to just be like, this is the musical on film, but we're making, we're taking licenses, and this is my new sort of take on how it's going to look. And, of course, Paul Tazwell is comes from Broadway. He has such a storied history as designer on Broadway, least of which is, or most and least of which in Hamilton, and then has moved into film, of course. So he understands very, like, expertly both worlds and the needs of costume in both worlds. And so marrying the two in like a musical film feels just so natural for him, and it's also been interesting for me to see there are certain shapes that I feel like are so quintessentially his. I just saw on Broadway Death Becomes Her, which Paul also costume designed. I'm like, where is he at the time? I mean, he's like the man is booked and busy. And he does this sort of like back sweep up collar, often in that musical that is so dramatic. And then I see it, in the Madame Morrible costumes, which is, it's nice to feel that kind of signature, the way there are ways in which you feel like an Adrian signature or an Edith Head signature, running through. But I guess that's all to say that I just, his ability to kind of infuse his own perspective and expert hand at the sort of fantastical and musical into a world while simultaneously bringing Susan Hilferty's designs along with him, I think is really, really poetic, and also served the film and served the audience of the film, which I think the filmmakers from the outset were very vocal about wanting to bring along, like the audience was with them from the beginning and needs to stay with them throughout, the whole movies, and so you see that I think play out in the costume design.
I mean, of course, like with Liz, I'm a big fan of Paul's. I think his career is very interesting in terms of like theater design to film design. Also, he does, I think, ballet also.
Oh, yeah.
So in many essence, I feel like there's some interesting aspects to look at in terms of his design. First of all, I feel like his designs are very in tune with motion. So body motion, how people dance, things like that. So he designs superbly well to it. There is this like very interesting element of designing for theater and how it translates into film because, like you said, he has some hallmarks to his design. Another big one, I think, in terms of his design is like how graphic it is. So I feel like that also comes from theater where people are sitting further away. So the graphicness of a costume and how that pairs together is pretty specific in terms of like how people view it. And I think it's very interesting then to bring that hybrid into film, which is sometimes more nuanced and settled and is not used to such graphicness. So it's very bold. And, like Liz said, he's a very, very confident designer. The other thing that's really interesting in Wicked that I feel like is interesting in a lot of these sort of like productions where it's like an imaginary world is that unlike Nosferatu, which borrows from maybe a 5-year time span period in terms of like what they, maybe 10 years because it, depending on like the cultural group that they're doing, is not a slave to any particular time period. So he is borrowing from 1940s Adrian. He is doing Victorian on certain characters, particularly Alphaba, that type of thing. He is borrowing from modern dance costumes for Glinda. And so it's this like hybrid. And it's also, again, speaking to him as a confident designer, it's very scary to put all these things in one film and be like, how do all these aesthetic directions and languages work in terms of something as a whole? Because they come from such different places, they might not, without an expert hand, feel like they're in the same movie. But he is very experienced and super well versed and crafted. I think it was seamless in sort of creating the interesting pockets of this world while making the world look very cohesive. And then I'm a big fan of Black in general. So I loved his costumes for Alphaba in terms of like their Victorian silhouette, but also how he layered his material choices for her of Black, but having this like rich depth in terms of like fabric manipulation and dyeing techniques to make the Black of her costumes really kind of pop and be three-dimensional. I feel like that's extremely hard. And then just, his playfulness on silhouette, I feel like that does take a very confident designer because I think like a less confident one might lean more conservative and he's like, no, let's just sort of like go for it. So I think all these elements made Wicked extremely special and very unique. And I think Paul's vision and just like the amount of everything that he did is so substantial.
Yeah, I mean, it's so whimsical, and that is a word that is sometimes frowned upon. It has its sort of context, but I often find that, sometimes collaborators will not, as you said, Helen, will ask for the more straightforward, or not want to have that hat take just one more turn to
Yeah.
the right, and this film is now like feels like it belongs in the Oxford English Dictionary, next to the definition of whimsy, but then one of the things that I always find very tricky about fantasy movies is, and movies where magic exists, is wanting to simultaneously like take me there visually, take me to whimsy, take me to strange and off kilter and asymmetric and layered. But I also need to believe that somebody made that dress, like that somehow this crown was created, that it has a hand to it. And if there's something about Wicked that feels very akin to me to Black Panther and Ruth's work on Black Panther, in that I think about Angela Bassett's crown piece and next to the Galinda crown, and think in wanting to feel like the hand of an artist, sort of tactile element and the works, the craftsmanship and the work behind these incredibly intricate filigreed three-dimensionally printed pieces, and I think both films are really successful in giving that sort of depth and layered feeling to these more out of thin air costumes, that, you could just go ahead and say that Merida Morrible took her wand, went like this, and she has a dress, but I think the ability to kind of really ground them, to use maybe an overused term, into feeling like they were made, is something that it feels to me like a hallmark of a lot of fantasy movies, thinking about even, a Star Wars, or, Dune, or Black Panther, Wicked. I think they're all in conversation with each other in terms of like, how do we take it to the nth degree of creativity while still not having costumes feel like planar, or without depth, or without a history, or without a sort of like process of how it was made within the world, and that to me feels like very enriched and very kind of, akin to the production design as well in Wicked, where you feel those layers and you can feel that kind of process that someone took to make it.
Yeah. And then also going back to like design language. So, from what Liz said, I think a lot of fantasy, even sci-fi, there is this like sometimes like this you do want it to be very fantastical. And so like in designs in a different hand might be like, let's throw everything in the kitchen sink at it, which I actually feel like is too chaotic and not strong enough. And so I feel like with Paul, one of his best attribute is like he could take all these different design languages, but make something where the design language is very cohesive in one garment, and then multiplying that by however many costumes they have in the film.
Yes.
And so even though it's a very maximalist looking film, the details, the lines, they all are very cohesive. They make a lot of sense together. And I think that is the strength of, the designer, is like the end product looks like things on the garment are speaking the same language, instead of using different elements and different techniques and they seem like they're in different projects. And so that's his expertise in it. It's just so very strong. And then also, it does have that Broadway tradition, but I also really love that it does have that Adrian, tradition from the original movies, which I deeply, deeply love. And I feel like the audience gets to, as Liz says, have this like visual travel with them in terms of like what was the original, what was the interpretation, and what is Paul's final product.
Yeah, I mean, totally. It has to, of course, the Broadway version, but it'd be with totally remiss not to mention that it has to be in visual dialogue with the original movie and with the Adrian designs, and it's so seamless the way in which he's able to do that. And I think, speaking to your point prior, it's so juicy to rewatch the movie and to sort of pause at like Munchkinland, and pause in Oz, and pause to see the ensemble cast and all these sort of, I mean, one is more intricate than the other. These costumes, that are just so, even in the Ozdas ballroom scene, I mean, everybody's costume is so layered and nuanced and juicy to look at. And at the same time, you still believe that like that munchkin got up in the morning and put that on, that they made the choice to put the shirt with the pant and the top and the shoes, and it's a fully realized like character ensemble. And I think to really see, Helen's point about that is to just go back and really pick out these people. And you might even see them in like Instagram posts that of Ariana Grande's, where she's like taking a photo with some of the cast, and to see, as you look in the photos, you can just see how so many choices. And I mean, what an incredible team he had as well, to sort of be able to communicate his vision on such a varied but vast scale to all the different, populations of the movie, and then have it executed so beautifully. It's really like a triumph.
Yeah, shout out to that team.
Shout out to that team.
We're always happy to team shout out on this show. Yeah. Want to recognize all the effort that goes into these. My takeaway from our conversation is that this is a really strong slate of contenders this year. All five of these is really the top of the craft on this. Whoever wins, I think there's no complaints on this. Whoever wins this group. That being said, are there any additional 2024 films you want to recognize for exemplary costume design?
I have to shout out Furiosa, Mad Max Saga, Jenny Bevan.
Oh, Jenny's like, she's chef's kiss.
She's chef's kiss every time is chef's kiss. There is one costume in that. There's just I love a like collage, assemblage. Like we got to take a bunch of different things and put it on a costume. Like it's just I think there's one costume in that movie for Chris Hemsworth. It's this parachute that follows him throughout the whole movie and goes from this beautiful gleaming white to bloody red and gets just sort of it's like a thesis in one piece. It's like the whole movie can be encapsulated in that one costume piece, and it's just so striking and how it kind of like speaks to everything going on with his character and how it becomes this like it starts as this regal cape and then it becomes this like downtrodden bloodied thing, and it's all from a parachute, and she also is such a great, they all are, but she does such a like insightful job on Instagram, like on social media, taking you through the process and the nitty gritty and how she had to do that film, slightly through the pandemic and, yeah. So I just have to shout out that one costume, that movie, always Jenny forever.
Jenny. The end of this is yes, Jenny forever.
Yeah.
She's so inspirational.
Yeah.
We can go out on that note. We'll call it a wrap. Thanks so much for both you guys being here. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave.
That's now 9 episodes about the technical Oscar categories in the canon. I hope you're keeping up. 4 more to go with a new release every 3 days until the ceremony on March 2nd. I'm trailing a bit on the editing. I have to admit, I think I catch up on time. Subscribe now if you haven't already so you can follow along. As always, I appreciate your feedback. You'll find my contact info on our website, below the line, oneword.biz. That's really nice. Closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music and John Wan for our logo. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at Redbubble. To all of our listeners, I appreciate you. Please rate us on each